Settle in close now, 'cause what I'm about to tell you happened right here in these mountains, back when my granddaddy was just a boy. This here's a story folks tried mighty hard to forget, but the truth has a way of clinging to the hills like morning fog on Cumberland Mountain. It was September of 1846, down in Overton County, Tennessee. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's a long time back. But some things, they don't fade with the years. Some things burn themselves into the very soil of these mountains. And this story, well, it's one of them. I'm going to tell you about a young woman named Patsy O'Neill, 18 years old, strong as an ox, and carrying secrets darker than a moonless night in these hollers. See, there's a reason the old-timers used to say, "We don't talk about that anymore," whenever her name came up. But I reckon enough time has passed. You deserve to know what really happened. Now, before we get into the thick of it, I got to ask you something. Have you ever known somebody in your own family that made you wonder how y'all could share the same blood? Someone who smiled at Sunday supper, but had ice water running through their veins? You think on that while I tell this tale. And listen here. If this story grabs hold of you the way it grabbed hold of me when I first heard it, go ahead and subscribe. There's more tales like this one, straight from the heart of these old mountains, and I aim to tell every last one of them before my time comes. Now then, let me take you back to that cabin at the foot of Cumberland Mountain. Edward O'Neill wasn't a rich man by any stretch. He worked his fingers to the bone as a day laborer, taking whatever jobs came his way, cutting timber for neighbors, trading horses, fixing fences. His little log cabin sat in the shadow of Cumberland Mountain, surrounded by a few outbuildings, a shed where his wife Sarah did the cooking, and a feed house a good ways off where they stored food for the livestock. Ed and Sarah had been married going on 20 years, and together they brought 6 children into this world. The youngest was just 2 years old, still toddling around in homespun clothes. The oldest boy, Jackson, was 12, strong enough to work alongside his daddy in the fields, and Ed made no secret that Jackson was his pride and joy. That boy could swing an axe, plow a straight furrow, and Ed never missed a chance to brag on him. But Jackson wasn't the oldest child. That title belonged to Patsy. Now, here's where things get complicated, and I need you to understand how life was for women back in them days. See, daughters weren't valued the same as sons. A boy could inherit land, work the farm, carry on the family name. But a girl? Well, she was just expected to cook, clean, bear children, and keep her mouth shut. Most folks didn't see any point in educating girls since they'd just end up married off anyway. Patsy, though, she worked harder than anyone on that farm. Every single morning, she was the first one up. She'd get all her younger siblings out of bed, cook breakfast for the whole family, then head out to work the fields right alongside the men. When the sun went down, she'd cook supper, get the little ones bathed, and put to bed. And then the whole thing would start over again the next day. You know what she got for all that work? Not a lick of recognition. Not a thank you. Nothing. Meanwhile, Jackson would do half the work and get praised to high heaven by their daddy. I reckon that kind of thing eats at a person. I've seen it happen in my own time when someone works themselves near to death and gets treated like they're invisible. It puts a bitterness in your soul that's hard to shake. Now, Most girls Patsy's age were already married and living with their husbands by then. But Patsy, she was still at home, and that cabin was getting mighty crowded. 6 children, 2 parents, all squeezed into a few rooms. Tempers were bound to flare. Ed had a drinking problem. Now, I don't mean he was a drunk, but when he got his hands on whiskey, he turned into a different man altogether. Most men take a drink to relax after a hard day's work. But Ed, he got argumentative. He got angry. And more often than not, he'd turn that anger on Patsy. He'd accuse her of running around with men, of being immoral, of carrying weapons like she was some kind of outlaw. Whether any of that was true or not, I can't say for certain, but I can tell you this. People in town had started talking. They'd seen Patsy arguing with her father in public. They'd heard her threaten him. Heard him threaten her right back. The thing is, most folks in the community remembered Ed as a decent man when he was sober. Never saw him raise a hand to Sarah or the little ones. But Patsy, she had a reputation for being wild, headstrong, and not afraid to speak her mind or flash a blade if she felt cornered. And Ed? Well, he'd finally had enough. He told Patsy she had until Monday, just 3 days, to pack her things and get off his land. You ever been told you weren't wanted in your own home? That the people who were supposed to love you didn't have room for you no more? That's a bitter poison to swallow, I'll tell you that. Makes a person desperate. Makes 'em think thoughts they shouldn't be thinking. But before that Monday ever came, a horror descended on that little cabin, one that would shock these mountains and make headlines clear across the ocean to places folks around here had never even heard of. It was mid-September, and the weather had been holding steady. Ed had picked up a timber-cutting job about 10 miles away in Crossville, and he'd been commuting back and forth each day. The corn was already in the crib, the tobacco hanging in the barn. Most of the hard work was done for the season. Things were looking up for the O'Neills, or so it seemed. That Friday, September 18th, started like any other day. Ed had breakfast with his family, kissed Sarah goodbye, hugged his young'uns, and saddled up his horse for another day of logging. He was in good spirits, too, 'cause it was payday. After 10 hours on the end of a cross-cut saw under the hot sun, he'd have money in his pocket and the whole weekend ahead of him. But back at the cabin, trouble was riding in. 2 men, William Upton and Nicholas Stevens, rode over from neighboring Fentress County that morning. They lived about 7 or 8 miles away, up on Cumberland Mountain, and they had a bone to pick with Ed O'Neill. See, they'd bought a horse from him a while back, and they claimed that horse was already sick when Ed sold it to 'em. Now they wanted their money back, every cent of it. When they got to the O'Neill place that morning, Ed wasn't home. Sarah told him he was working in Crossville and wouldn't be back till evening. So Upton and Stevens said they'd come back later, and off they went. But they didn't go home. Instead, they headed down to the local saloon and spent the day getting themselves good and liquored up. Somewhere along the way, they picked up a half-gallon of whiskey to take with them. Now, here's where the story gets murky, and you gotta pay attention, 'cause different folks told it different ways, and somebody's lying through their teeth. According to Upton and Stevens, and mind you, this is what they claimed later, after they got caught in a whole mess of lies, they rode back to the O'Neill place late Friday evening. Ed still hadn't come home, but Patsy was there. She'd spent the day digging ginseng up on the hillside, and when she got back, well, let's just say the three of 'em had an arrangement that wasn't fit for polite conversation. Both men were married with families of their own, but that didn't stop 'em. At first, they lied about where they'd been that night. Upton said they slept outside on the mountain. Then he changed his story, said they stayed at his elderly uncle's house. Finally, when the lies stopped working, they admitted the truth. They spent the night with Patsy in that feed house, sneaking around in the dark, checking every so often to make sure nobody in the main cabin woke up and caught 'em. They said they left before sunrise Saturday morning, rode on home, and that was that. Claimed they had nothing to do with what came next. And here's the peculiar thing. Witnesses saw both men riding through a nearby settlement that morning, and their white shirts didn't have a speck of blood on 'em, not a single drop. Now, you hold on to that detail, 'cause it matters. But Patsy told a different story altogether, and hers was a whole lot darker. She said her father came home Friday evening, drunk and meaner than a snake with a broken back. Said he'd bought whiskey with his pay and drank most of it on the ride home. When he got there, he started yelling at Sarah, choking her even, and when Patsy tried to get him to stop, he turned on her, backhanded her so hard she flipped over in her chair, grabbed her by the hair and dragged her across the floor, screaming that she had until Monday to get out. According to Patsy, she was terrified, so scared she ran through the dark woods for 2 miles to a neighbor's place, a woman named Mrs. Householder. Now, Patsy claimed her daddy told her to take some potatoes to Mrs. Householder and spend the night there. Even gave her a message to pass along, that Ed would tell Mrs. Householder where her husband had run off to. See, Mr. Householder had up and disappeared some time back, and his wife was desperate for answers. Patsy said she followed her father's orders, spent the night at the Householder place, and came back Monday morning with Mrs. Householder in tow, both of them expecting to find Ed ready to spill the beans about the missing husband. Instead, they found ashes and death. Now, I've turned this story over in my mind more times than I can count, and here's what bothers me. If Ed O'Neill knew where Mr. Householder had gone, why hadn't he said anything before? Why wait until the very night before he planned to... Well, we'll get to that. The whole thing reeks of a story made up on the fly. But whether it was Ed's rage or Patsy's revenge that set the wheels turning, one thing's for certain. By Saturday night, 7 souls would be gone from this earth, and these mountains would never be the same. Saturday evening, folks in the area noticed a thick column of black smoke rising from the direction of the O'Neill place, darker and heavier than any cook fire ought to be. By the time the sun set, that smoke had turned the whole sky an ugly shade of gray. By Sunday morning, neighbors rode over to check on things. What they found stopped 'em cold in their tracks. The cabin had burned to the ground. Nothing left but a pile of smoking rubble and ash, timbers still glowing red in places. The heat was so fierce you couldn't get within 10 feet of it. And the family? Gone. All of 'em. Ed O'Neill, who'd left Friday morning promising to come back that evening, never showed up for work on Saturday. His employer had expected him, counted on him even, but Ed was nowhere to be found. The men stood there in silence for a moment, the kind of heavy silence that settles over a place when you know in your gut that death is near. One of 'em finally spoke up. Reckon they made it out? Nobody answered. They already knew. One man grabbed a shovel. Another found a long piece of timber to pry up the debris. They began searching through the wreckage, and that's when one of them, a fella named Johnson, I believe, called out in a voice that didn't sound quite human, "Boys, boys, you need to see this." The others came running, and what they saw made even the strongest among 'em turn away and retch in the weeds. Under the floorboards there'd been a cellar, shallow thing, no more than 2.5 feet deep and 6 feet long, barely big enough to store a few bags of potatoes. And crammed inside that tiny space were 7 bodies, piled on top of each other like cordwood. Ed and Sarah were on top of the heap. The fire had done its worst to them. Their heads and legs were burned away to almost nothing, but underneath them, shielded somewhat from the flames, were the 5 children. And Lord have mercy, when the men pulled those little ones out, there was no mistaking what had happened. Those children hadn't died in the fire. They'd been dead before the first flame ever touched that cabin. The 2 smallest, including that 2-year-old baby, had wounds on their heads that could only have come from one thing, an axe. Clean, deliberate blows, the kind that don't happen by accident. The men worked in grim silence, pulling the bodies out one by one and laying 'em on the grass. Some of those fellas had known the O'Neills their whole lives, had shared meals with 'em, helped 'em bring in the harvest, and now they were pulling their charred remains from a pit like they were nothing more than slaughtered livestock. I've heard it said that the smell of burnt human flesh is something you never forget. It gets into your nose, your clothes, your memory, and it stays there. Some of those men never spoke of that morning again for the rest of their lives. But here's what sent chills down every spine. Before they'd even started digging through the rubble, Patsy was there, standing by the ruins calm as a Sunday morning, like she was waiting for 'em. When someone asked where her family was, she said clear as day, without a tremble in her voice, "They're in the cellar, burnt." Now you think about that. The cellar was buried under boards, ash, and debris. Nobody could see down into it yet, but Patsy knew. She described exactly how the bodies were positioned, how the heads were turned, which way the children were facing. She knew because she'd seen 'em before the fire. And then they found the axe, stuck in a tree stump about 100 feet from the cabin, blade still crusty with dried blood, strands of human hair matted in it. The men didn't need a lawman to tell 'em what that meant. But there was more. Oh, there was more. In that feed house where Upton, Stevens, and Patsy had spent Friday night, they found items that had no business being there. Ed O'Neill's Bible. The deed to his land, tucked inside that Bible like someone was planning to keep it safe, or planning to claim it. A dress stuffed with feathers and another filled with cotton, like somebody was preparing to travel light and fast. And hidden in the weeds nearby, betting that Patsy had tried to stash away, blood stains on her petticoat and undergarments. By Monday morning, all 3 of 'em, Patsy O'Neill, William Upton, and Nicholas Stevens, were under arrest. The sheriff locked 'em up in separate cells, and the questions began. But nobody was talking. Not yet. I'll tell you something that's haunted me about this case. Those white shirts. Upton and Stevens rode through town the morning after the murders with clean clothes, not a drop of blood on 'em. If they'd helped kill 7 people with an axe, how'd they manage that? Or were they telling the truth? Were they just a couple of fools who got tangled up with a woman who had murder in her heart? We may never know the full truth, but what happened next would make this story famous from New York to South Carolina, from Vermont newspapers to the Boston Almanac. The O'Neill murders became one of the most talked about crimes of 1846, and the trial, well, that was a spectacle nobody expected. The trial in Livingston, Tennessee, became the biggest spectacle these mountains had ever seen. Folks traveled from 3 counties over just to get a seat in the courthouse. Reporters came from as far away as New York City. Can you imagine that? City folks riding all the way down here to write about our troubles. The courtroom was packed tighter than a smokehouse in November, people spilling out into the halls and the yard outside, straining to hear every word. Newspapers across the country were eating it up. At first, many of them believed Ed O'Neill was the monster, that he'd killed his own wife and children in a drunken rage, then burned the place down and threw himself on the pile. A New York paper called him a brute in human form. A South Carolina paper called him a wretch. Even a Vermont newspaper ran the story, painting Ed as a demon who'd slaughtered his family. But as the evidence piled up, the story started to change. The prosecution built their case piece by piece, like stacking stones for a wall. They brought up the Bible and the land deed found in the feed house, the blood-stained dress that Patsy claimed came from butchering a chicken, even though nobody remembered her preparing any chicken that day. The fact that she knew where the bodies were and how they were positioned before anyone had uncovered them. Patsy stuck to her story on the stand, said the blood on her dress was from cooking, said her father had been in a rage, threatened to kill them all, and she'd run to Mrs. Householder's place for safety. She cried. She trembled. She played the part of the frightened daughter real well. But then came the testimony that turned the whole courtroom on its head. A woman named Christina Hensley took the stand. She'd been locked up in the same jail cell as Patsy before the trial, and she testified that Patsy had confessed everything to her. Said Patsy admitted she'd killed her entire family, every last one of them, with that axe on Friday night. Started with her father and worked her way down to the baby. Put 'em all in the cellar and set the cabin on fire Saturday evening to cover it up. And according to Hensley, Patsy had said one more thing that cleared the men. The boys Upton and Stevens were clear of it. The courtroom erupted, people shouting, the judge banging his gavel, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. But the defense wasn't done. They called 6 men to the stand, respected citizens from the area, who all swore under oath that Christina Hensley was a liar. Said she'd lie about her own name if it suited her. Said you couldn't trust a single word that came out of her mouth, even if she swore on a stack of Bibles. And then William Upton took the stand and dropped his own bombshell. He admitted, finally, after all the lies, that he and Stevens had spent Friday night with Patsy in that feed house, engaged in what he called real delicate-like a conversation. Said they'd arranged it ahead of time. Said they lied to the authorities because they didn't want their wives finding out. He swore up and down that after midnight, both men rode home and had nothing to do with the killings. And those white shirts with no blood, that seemed to back up his story. But the jury wasn't buying it. Not completely. After deliberating, they came back with a verdict that shook the whole county. Guilty, all 3 of them. Patsy O'Neill Troxdale. She'd married a man named Troxdale while hiding out in Kentucky after the murders. William Upton and Nicholas Stevens were all found guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence? Death by hanging. You'd think that would be the end of it. Justice served, case closed. But you'd be wrong. See, the defense filed an appeal, and they had a strong argument. Turned out one of the jurors, a fellow named Shelton, had been investigating the case on his own before the trial even started. He'd gone around asking questions, looking at evidence, and he'd told people he thought all three of them should hang. The defense argued he wasn't impartial, that he'd already made up his mind before hearing a lick of testimony in court. The Tennessee Supreme Court agreed. They threw out the verdict and ordered a new trial. Even the great Judge William B. Turley, one of the finest legal minds Tennessee ever produced, wrote in his opinion that the case was horrible and mysterious and deserved the strictest adherence to justice. And then silence. The state of Tennessee never retried the case. There's no record of a second trial. No record of sentencing. Patsy Troxdale, William Upton, and Nicholas Stevens just vanished from the legal system. Now, I've thought long and hard about why that might be. Maybe the state didn't think they could get another conviction without Christina Hensley's testimony and with 6 men calling her a liar. Maybe the prosecutors figured it wasn't worth the fight. Maybe there was political pressure, or maybe folks just wanted to forget the whole ugly business. But here's what we do know, and I'm grateful to a couple of men for uncovering this part of the story. Russell Fowler, an attorney who wrote about the case years later, and Dale Welch, a local historian who wouldn't let the truth stay buried. After the trial was thrown out, Patsy was jailed for a spell. Authorities rented out her labor to local households. That's what they did with women prisoners back then. Sent them out to cook and clean for other folks. She lived quiet for a time, keeping her head down, and most people figured she'd take her secrets to the grave. But 30 years later, as she lay dying, something broke loose inside her. Dale Welch interviewed a man, this was about 30 years ago now, who'd been in his 90s at the time. That old man had been present in the room when Patsy Troxdale drew her last breaths. He said she got restless near the end, thrashing in the bed, saying over and over, "I have to tell, I have to tell." And till she did. She confessed to murdering her entire family, said she'd planned it, said Upton and Stevens had helped her think through it, but she was the one who swung that axe, every blow, 7 times. And then she set the fire to hide what she'd done. But then, Lord help us, she confessed to another murder, one nobody had ever known about. Years before, she'd been out in the woods digging ginseng when she came across a little boy doing the same. That boy had found a whole sack full of it, more than Patsy had ever seen, worth real money. And rather than let him keep it, she killed him, killed a child for a bag of roots. Then she fed his body to the hogs on the farm so there'd be nothing left to find. 2 crimes, one that shocked the nation, and one that stayed hidden until she couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. Now, as for the men, Nicholas Stevens never lived to hear that deathbed confession. He went off to fight for the Confederacy when the Civil War came, and he died in battle. Whether he was guilty or innocent, he paid a price. William Upton, his fate's been lost to time. No records, no grave that we've found. Maybe he lived quiet, or maybe guilt ate him alive. We'll never know. But Patsy, she carried that weight for 30 years before she finally let it go. So there you have it, the story of Patsy Troxdale and the Cumberland Mountain murders that shook these mountains and made headlines clear around the world. I've lived a long time, and I've heard a lot of stories, some true, some half-true, some pure fiction. But this one stayed with me in a way that few others have. What makes a person capable of something like that? Was it bitterness? Years of being told she didn't matter? Of working herself to the bone while her brother got all the praise? Was it desperation, knowing she had 3 days before she'd be thrown out with nowhere to go? Or was there something broken in her from the start? Something dark that was just waiting for the right moment to come crawling out? I don't pretend to have the answer. I'm not sure anybody does. What I do know is this. These mountains hold a lot of secrets. Some are buried 6 feet under the soil. Some are written in yellowed court documents, gathering dust in courthouse basements. Some are passed down in whispers from granddaddy to grandchild, so the truth don't die with the people who lived it. Evil ain't always loud. It don't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it lives right under your roof, sits across from you at the supper table, and you don't see it coming till it's too late. My granddaddy used to say, "Keep your eyes open and your heart guarded, but don't let the darkness make you hard." I think about that a lot when I tell stories like this one. Yes, there's evil in the world. Yes, terrible things happen, but we can't let it poison us. We got to remember the good folks, the neighbors who came running when they saw that smoke, the men who dug through those ashes even though it broke their hearts. You take care of the people you love. You pay attention when something don't feel right. And you remember that even in the most beautiful places like these mountains, where the laurel blooms and the creeks run clear, darkness can take root if we're not careful. Thanks for sitting with me through this hard tale. If it moved you or made you think, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with folks who appreciate true stories from these hills. And subscribe. If you're of a mind to, I've got more stories to tell, and some of them might just surprise you. Until next time, you take care now. Watch after your kin. And remember, some stories need to be told, even the ones that hurt to hear. Maybe especially those